On April 20th, 1999, a school shooting and attempted bombing occurred at Columbine High School in Columbine, Colorado. The perpetrators were 12th grade Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. They murdered 12 students and one teacher. 10 students were killed in the school library, and an additional 21 people were injured by gunshots and gunfire that was exchanged with the police. 3 more were injured while trying to escape. Eric and Dylan had intended for the attack to be a bombing and secondarily a shooting, but they failed to detonate several of the homemade bombs they planted in the school, which caused them to launch into the shooting instead. 2 bombs were set up as diversions at another location away from the school, one of which had partially detonated. The motive behind this attack remains inconclusive to the police. However, they had planned the attack for at least a year and had hoped to have a large number of victims. Now, who exactly were the perpetrators? Eric was born on April 9th, 1981 in Wichita. The family relocated often as his father was in the U.S. Air Force as a transport pilot. The family moved from Plattsburgh, New York to Littleton, Colorado in July 1993 when his father retired from military service. The family lived in rented accommodations for the first 3 years. It was during this period that he attended Ken Carl Middle School, and it was here Eric met Dylan. Dylan was born on September 11th, 1981 in Lakewood, Colorado. His parents were pacifists and attended a Lutheran church with their children. Now, both boys seem to have a criminal history. In 1996, 15-year-old Eric created a private website on America Online for first-person shooter video games, but he began a blog. It included details about him sneaking out of his house to cause mischief and vandalism, such as lighting fireworks with Dylan and other friends. In early 1997, the blog postings began to show the first signs of Eric's anger against society. By the end of the year, the blog contained instructions on how to make explosives. He didn't have many viewers on the blog, and there was no cause for concern. That was until August 1997. He ended a blog post detailing murderous fantasies. He said, "All I want to do is kill and injure as many of you as I can, especially a few people, like Brooks Brown." Brooks was his classmate. His parents had seen the blog and contacted Jefferson County Sheriff's Office on August 7, 1997. An investigator wrote a draft affidavit to request a search warrant for Eric's house, but this was never submitted to a judge. On January 30th, 1998, Eric and Dylan were arrested for breaking into a white van parked near Littleton and stealing tools and computer equipment. They attended a joint court hearing where they pled guilty to the felony theft. The judge then sentenced them to a juvenile diversion program. As a result, both of them attended mandatory classes such as anger management and talked with diversion officers. They both were eventually released from diversion several weeks early because of positive actions in the program and were put on probation. After being released, Eric reverted his website back to just hosting user-created levels of doom. He began to write his thoughts in a journal instead. In both their journals, they would plot the attack. Soon after beginning his journal, Eric typed out one plan of attack, which included possibly escaping to a foreign country after the massacre or hijacking an aircraft at Denver International Airport and crashing it into New York City. Dylan had already been keeping his own journal since March 1997. As early as November of that year, Dylan had mentioned going on a killing spree. Dylan used his journal to vent about his personal problems as well as what he'd wear and use during the attack. Eric also made entries on topics such as his sexuality, where he described the desire for sex with women, more heinously his desire to sexually assault and torture them in his bedroom. He also expressed an interest in cannibalism and stated he would like to dismember a woman who he could have sex with. Their schoolwork foreshadowed the massacre. They both displayed themes of violence in their creative writing projects. In December 1997, Eric wrote a paper on school shootings titled Guns in School, and a poem from the perspective of a bullet. Dylan wrote a short story about a man killing students, which worried his teacher so much that she alerted his parents. Both of them actively researched war and murder. Eric wrote a paper on Nazis, and Dylan wrote a paper on Charles Manson. In a psychology class, Eric wrote he dreamed of going on a shooting spree with Dylan. Eric's journal described several experimental bomb detonations. Nearly a year before the massacre, Dylan wrote a message in Eric's 1998 yearbook, killing enemies, blowing up stuff, killing cops. My wrath for January's incident will be godlike, not to mention our revenge in the Commons, which was the cafeteria. The basement tapes. Now both of them had enrolled in video production classes and kept 5 videotapes that were recorded with school equipment. Only 2 of these tapes have been released. The remaining 3 tapes detailed their plans and reasons for the massacre, including the ways they hid their weapons and deceived their parents. Most of these were shot in Eric's basement. 30 minutes before the attack, they made a final video saying goodbye and apologizing to friends and families. These tapes were published by Times Magazine in December 1999. The victims' family members threatened to sue Jefferson County. As a result, select victim families and journalists were allowed to see them, and they were then kept from the public indefinitely for fear of inspiring future massacres. These tapes have since been destroyed. It is believed by investigators that the pair intended to detonate their propane bombs in the cafeteria at the busiest lunch hour, killing hundreds of students. After this, they would shoot and stab survivors as well as lob bombs. Bombs set in their cars in the parking lot would also eventually detonate, killing more students as well as possibly any police officers, paramedics, firemen, or reporters who had come to the school. However, this failed to occur since the cafeteria bombs and the ones in the car failed to detonate. A total of 188 rounds of ammunition was fired by them during the massacre. Firing nearly twice as much as Dylan, Eric fired his carbine rifle a total of 96 times, 47 shots outside, 36 shots inside, and 13 shots in the library. Eric also discharged his shotgun 25 times, 21 times in the library, and 4 times inside. Dylan fired the TEC-9 handgun 55 times, 3 shots outside, 31 shots inside, and 21 shots in the library. Dylan also fired 12 rounds from his double-barreled shotgun, twice outside, 3 inside, and 6 inside the library. Law enforcement officers fired 141 rounds during exchanges of gunfire between both Eric and Dylan. On Tuesday morning, April 20th, 1999, Eric and Dylan placed 2 duffel bags in the cafeteria. Each bag contained propane bombs set to detonate during the A lunch shift, which began at 11:15 a.m. 2 backpacks filled with pipe bombs, aerosol canisters, and small propane bombs were also placed in a field about 3 miles south from the high school and 2 miles south of the fire station. The bombs were intended as a diversion to draw firefighters and emergency personnel away from the school. Only the pipe bombs and one of the aerosol canisters detonated, causing a small fire, but that was put out quickly by the fire department. It had gone off after it was first moved. They changed their clothes and returned to the school separately. Eric parked his car in the junior student parking lot, and Dylan parked in the adjoining senior student parking lot. The cafeteria was their primary bomb target. The cafeteria had a long outside window wall, ground level doors, and was just north of the senior parking lot. The library was located above the cafeteria in the second story of the window wall. Both their cars also contained bombs. Eric had encountered Brooks Brown in the parking lot. He had long-standing disputes with him. According to Brooks, who was smoking, he was surprised to see Eric as he had realized he missed a class test. Eric wasn't the type to miss school days which held important academic obligations, and Brooks berated him for missing the test. Eric didn't care. He said it doesn't matter anymore. Brooks, I like you now. Get out of here. Go home. Brooks felt uneasy and had already prepared to skip his next class, so he walked down South Pierce Street and left. Eric and Dylan armed themselves, using straps and webbing to conceal weapons beneath their trench coats. They lugged bags containing bombs and ammunition. Eric had concealed his shotgun in one of the bags. The cafeteria bombs, as we know, failed to detonate. Had they exploded, they would have killed or severely wounded the 488 students in that cafeteria, in turn damaging the school structures, collapsing the library into the cafeteria, and possibly killing more students and staff. 17-year-old Rachel Scott and her friend Richard Castaldo were having lunch and sitting on the grass next to the west entrance of the school. Dylan threw a pipe bomb towards the parking lot. It only partially detonated, causing it to give off smoke, and Richard didn't think anything of it. He thought it was more like a senior prank. Likewise, several other students during the incident first thought they were watching a prank. A witness reported hearing "go, go" before Dylan and Eric pulled their guns from beneath their trench coats and began shooting. Rachel Scott was killed instantly when she was hit 4 times with rounds fired from Eric's carbine. 1 shot was to the left temple. Richard Castaldo was shot 8 times in the chest, arm and abdomen by both of them. He fell unconscious to the ground and was left paralysed below the chest. After firing twice, Dylan's TEC-9 jammed, and he stopped shooting while trying to reload a new magazine into his pistol. Eric took off his trench coat and aimed his carbine down the west staircase in the direction of 3 students: Daniel Rawbaugh, Sean Graves, and Lance Kirkland. Again, the students just thought that this was a prank and it was paintball guns, and they were about to walk up the staircase directly below the shooters. Eric fired 10 times, killing Daniel, while injuring Sean and Lance. William Dave Sanders, a teacher and a coach at the school, was in the cafeteria when he heard the gunfire and began warning other students. Eric turned west and fired 7 shots in the direction of 5 students sitting on the grassy hillside adjacent to the steps and opposite the west entrance of the school. Michael Johnson was hit in the face, leg and arm, but ran and escaped. Mark Taylor was shot in the chest, arms and leg and fell to the ground, where he faked death, and the other 3 escaped uninjured. Dylan walked down the steps towards the cafeteria. He first shot once at the body of Daniel with his shotgun, and then came up to Lance Kirkland, who was already wounded and lying on the ground, weakly calling for help. Dylan said, "Sure, I'll help you," and then shot him in the jaw with his shotgun. Although nearly fatally injured, Lance would survive. Sean, who was paralysed beneath the waist, had crawled into the doorway of the cafeteria's west entrance and collapsed. He rubbed his blood on him and played dead. After shooting Lance, Dylan walked towards the cafeteria door. He then stepped over Sean to enter, and Sean remembers hearing Dylan say, "Sorry, dude." Dylan only briefly entered the cafeteria and did not shoot at the several people still inside. Eric was still on top of the stairs and was shooting and had severely wounded and partially paralysed 17-year-old Anne-Marie Hochhalter as she tried to flee. Dylan came out of the cafeteria and went to join Eric. They each shot once at the student standing close to a soccer field but did not hit anyone. They walked toward the west entrance, throwing pipe bombs in several directions, including onto the roof. Only a few of these pipe bombs actually detonated. Art teacher Patty Nielsen was inside the school, and she had noticed the commotion and walked toward the west entrance with student Brian Anderson. She also thought it was a prank and was going to tell them to knock it off. But as soon as Brian opened the first set of double doors, the gunmen fired together, injuring him with flying glass. Patty was hit in the shoulder with shrapnel. They both ran back down into the library. She alerted students inside, telling them to get under desks and keep silent. She then dialed 911 and hid under the library's administrative counter. Brian fell to the floor, bleeding from his injuries, then hid inside the magazine room adjacent to the library. Eric, at the west entrance, immediately turned and fired 10 shots from his carbine at Deputy Neil Gardner, who was 60 yards away. As he was reloading, Neil fired 4 rounds at Eric from his service pistol. He thought he had hit him, but Eric had merely ducked behind the building. Eric then fired at least 4 more shots at Neil. No one was shot during this gunfire. By this point, Eric had shot 47 times and Dylan 5 times. They entered through the west entrance, moving along the main hallway to the north, throwing pipe bombs and shooting at anyone they encountered. Dylan shot Stephanie Munson in the ankle, but she was able to walk out the school. The pair then shot out the windows to the east entrance of the school. Deputies Paul Smoker and Paul Mager were writing a traffic ticket north of the school when the call came in at 11:23 a.m. Taking the shortest route, they drove their motorcycles over the grass between the athletic fields and headed towards the west entrance. In total, there were 6 deputies there now. They had begun to rescue 2 wounded students near the ball fields when another gunfight broke out at 11:26 a.m. as Eric returned to the double doors and again began shooting at Deputy Neil Gardner. Inside the school cafeteria, William Dave Sanders and two custodians, John Curtis and Jay Galantine, initially told students to get under tables. They successfully managed to get the students up the staircase leading to the second floor of the school. The stairs were located around the corner from the library hallway in the main south hallway. Dave Sanders then tried to secure as much of the school as he could. Eric and Dylan were now in the main hallway. Dave and another student were down at the end of the hallway where he gestured for students in the library to stay. They encountered both shooters who were approaching from the corner of the north hallway. They both started to run in the opposite direction of the shooters. Eric and Dylan shot at them both. Eric hit Dave twice in the back and neck, hitting his teeth on exit, but missing the student. The latter ran into the science classroom and warned everyone to hide. Dylan walked towards Dave, who had collapsed, and tossed a pipe bomb, then returned to Eric up the library hallway. Dave struggled toward the science area and a teacher took him into the classroom where 30 students were located. A student, Aaron Hansey, who was brought over from another classroom by teachers because he knew first aid. With the assistance of another student, Kevin Starkey, and teacher Teresa Miller, Aaron administered first aid to Dave for 3 hours. At 11:29, Eric and Dylan entered the library. 52 students, 2 teachers, and 2 librarians were inside. Eric yelled at everyone to get up loud enough that it was heard on the 911 call. When no one did, he said, "Fine, I'll start shooting anyway." Eric fired his shotgun twice at a desk. Student Evan Todd had been standing near a pillar when the shooters entered the library and had just taken cover behind a copier. Evan was hit by wood splinters in the eye and lower back, but was not seriously injured. They walked further into the library towards 2 rows of computers. Sitting at the north row was disabled student Kyle Velasquez. Dylan fired his shotgun, fatally hitting him in the head and back. They reloaded. They then walked between the computer rows towards the windows facing the outside staircase. Throughout the library massacre, they ordered everybody to get up and said how long they had been waiting for this and seemed to be enjoying themselves. Windows were shot out where further police officers had arrived. The shooters hid from the windows and returned fire. Dylan removed his trench coat and fired his shotgun at a nearby table, injuring 3 students, Patrick Ireland, Daniel Steepleton, and Mackay Hall. Eric walked toward the lower row of computer desks with his shotgun and fired a single shot under the first desk while on one knee. He hit 14-year-old Stephen Kerno with a mortal wound to the neck. He then moved to the adjacent computer desk, injuring 17-year-old Casey Rusager with a shot which passed completely through her right shoulder, also grazing her neck and severing a major artery. Eric walked to a table in the south of the lower computer area with 2 students underneath, Cassie Bernal and Emily Wyant. Eric slapped the surface of the table twice as he knelt and said peekaboo, before shooting Cassie once in the head with a shotgun, killing her. He turned to the next table where Bree Palisque sat next to the table rather than under it. Eric's nose was bleeding as he had recoiled on his gun. He asked Bree if she wanted to die, and she responded with a plea for her life. He laughed and said, "Everyone's gonna die." When Dylan said shoot her, Eric said, "No, we're gonna blow up the school anyway." Dylan had noticed Patrick helping Mackay, who had suffered a wound to the knee. As Patrick tried to help, Mackay's head rose above the table slightly. Dylan shot him a second time, hitting him twice in the head and once in the foot. Patrick was knocked unconscious but survived. Dylan walked toward another table where he discovered 18-year-old Isaiah Scholes, 16-year-old Matthew Ketcher, and 16-year-old Craig Scott. Craig, who was Rachel's younger brother, hiding under the table. Dylan called out to Eric and used a racial slur and tried to pull Isaiah out from under the table. Eric left Bree and joined Dylan. According to witnesses, they taunted Isaiah for a few seconds, making derogatory racial comments. They both fired under the table. Eric shot Isaiah once in the chest, killing him, and Dylan shot and killed Matthew. Meanwhile, Craig was uninjured, lying in a pool of blood of his friends, feigning death. Dylan walked to the east area of the library. Eric joined him and they shot at a display case next to the door, then turned and shot toward the closest table, hitting and injuring 17-year-old Mark Kintgen in the head and the shoulder. He then turned toward the table to the left and fired, injuring 18-year-old Lisa Kreutz, Lauren Townsend, and Veline Schooner with the same shotgun blast. Dylan then moved toward the same table and fired several shots with the TEC-9, killing Lauren. Eric moved to a table where he fired twice, injuring 16-year-old Nicole Nowlin and John Tomlin. John moved out from under the table. Dylan shot him repeatedly, killing him. Eric walked back over to the other side of the table where Lauren lay dead. Behind the table, 16-year-old Kelly Fleming had sat next to the table rather than beneath it due to the lack of space. Eric shot her with his shotgun, hitting her in the back and killing her. He shot at the table behind Kelly, hitting Lauren, who was already dead, hitting Lisa again, and wounding 18-year-old Gianna Park. The shooters moved to the center of the library and reloaded their weapons. Eric pointed his carbine under the table, but the student moved out the way. Eric turned his gun back on the student and told him to identify himself. It was John Savage, an acquaintance of Dylan. He asked Dylan what they were doing, to which he said, "Oh, just killing people." John asked if they were going to kill him. However, due to background noise, Dylan said, "What?" and John repeated himself. Dylan said no and told him to run. John fled. Eric turned and fired his carbine at the table directly north of where he had been sitting, hitting the ear and hand of 15-year-old Daniel Mouser. Daniel retaliated by shoving a chair at Eric or grabbing at his leg. Eric fired again and hit Daniel in the center of the face at close range, killing him. Eric moved south and fired 3 shots under another table, critically injuring 17-year-old Jennifer Doyle and Austin Eubank. Dylan shot once, fatally wounding 17-year-old Corey DePuta at 11:35 a.m. There were no further victims. They had killed 10 people in the library and wounded 12. Eric threw a Molotov cocktail toward the southern west end of the library, but it failed to explode. They converged close to where Evan had moved after being wounded. Dylan pulled the chair out from the desk, pointed his TEC-9 at Evan, who was wearing a white hat. When they first entered the library, they had said, "Anyone wearing a white hat or a sports emblem on it is dead." Dylan asked him if he was a jock, to which he said no. Dylan said, "Well, that's good, we don't like jocks." He then demanded to see his face. Evan partly lifted his hat so his face would remain obscured. Dylan asked Evan to give him one reason why he should not kill him. "I don't want trouble." Dylan angrily said, "Trouble? You don't even know what trouble is." Evan tried to correct himself. "That's not what I meant. I mean, I don't have a problem with you guys. I never will and I never have." Dylan then told Eric he was going to let Evan live, but that if Eric wanted to kill him, he could. Eric paid no attention and stated that they should head to the cafeteria. Dylan joined Eric at the library entrance. They walked out of the library at 11:36 a.m. Cautiously fearing the shooters might return, 10 injured and 29 uninjured survivors began to evacuate the library through the northern emergency exit door, which led to the sidewalk adjacent to the west entrance. Casey was evacuated by Craig Scott. Had she not been evacuated at this point, she would have likely bled to death from her injuries. Patrick, still unconscious, and Lisa, unable to move, remained in the building. Patty, the art teacher, crawled into the exterior break room, into which Dylan had earlier fired shots and hid in a cupboard. After leaving the library, they entered the science area, where they caused a fire in an empty storage closet. It was extinguished by a teacher who had hidden in an adjacent room. They both proceeded toward the south hallway, where they shot into an empty science room. At 11:44 a.m., they were captured on school security cameras as they re-entered the cafeteria. The recording shows Eric crouching against the rail on the staircase and firing toward the propane bomb and examined it. Dylan lit a Molotov cocktail and threw it at a propane bomb. About a minute later, the gallon of fuel attached to the bomb ignited, causing a fire that was extinguished by fire sprinklers a few minutes later. They left the cafeteria at 11:46. They returned to the main north and south hallways of the school and fired several shots into the walls and ceilings as students and teachers hid in rooms. At 11:56, they returned to the cafeteria and briefly entered the school kitchen. They returned up the staircase and into the south hallway at 12 p.m. They re-entered the library, which was empty of survivors, except for the unconscious Patrick and injured Lisa. Once inside, at 12:02 p.m., police were shot at again through the library windows and they returned fire. Nobody was injured in this exchange again. By 12:05 p.m., all gunfire from the school had ceased. By 12:08 p.m., both Eric and Dylan had killed themselves. Eric had sat down with his back to the bookshelf and fired his shotgun through the roof of his mouth. Dylan went down on his knee and shot himself in the left temple with his TEC-9. According to an article by the Rocky Mountain News, Patty overheard them shout 1, 2, 3, before a loud boom. However, Patty later said that she had never spoken to either of the writers of that article. In 2002, the National Enquirer published 2 post-mortem photos of Eric and Dylan in the library. Dylan's gun was underneath his body and so unseen in the photo, leading to the speculation that Eric shot Dylan before killing himself. However, some of Dylan's blood was on Eric's legs. Just before shooting himself, Dylan lit a Molotov cocktail on a nearby table, underneath which Patrick was laying, which caused the tabletop to momentarily catch fire. Underneath the scorched film of material was a piece of Eric's brain matter, suggesting he had shot himself at this point. The SWAT team response. By 12 p.m, the teams were stationed outside the school and ambulance started taking the wounded to local hospitals. 2 SWAT teams started to enter at 1:09 p.m, moving from classroom to classroom, discovering hidden students and faculty. They entered at the end of the school opposite the library. However, they struggled with the old maps of the school building, unaware a new wing had recently been added, and by the sound of fire alarms. Patrick Island had regained and lost consciousness several times after being shot by Dylan. Paralyzed on his right side, he crawled to the library window, where on live television at 2:38 p.m, he stretched out the window intending to fall into the arms of 2 SWAT team members standing on the roof of an emergency vehicle, but instead falling directly onto the vehicle's roof in a pool of blood. He became known as the boy in the window. The team members Don Kramer and John Ramone were later criticized for allowing him to drop more than 7 feet to the ground while doing nothing to ensure he could be lowered to the ground safely or break his fall. At 2:15 p.m, students placed a sign in the window saying "one bleeding to death" in order to alert police and medical personnel of Dave Sanders' location in the science room. Police initially feared it was a ruse by the shooters. A shirt was also tied to the doorknob. At 2:30, the shirt was spotted. By 2:40, SWAT officers evacuated the room of students and called for paramedics. Aaron and Kevin refused to leave Dave behind. By 3 p.m, SWAT officers had moved Dave to a storage room. As they did so, a paramedic arrived and found that he had no pulse. He had died of his injuries in the storage room before he could receive medical care. He was the only teacher to die in the shooting. On April 30th, it was decided that the drafted affidavit written by Michael Guerrero for a search warrant for Eric's house, which was created more than a year before the shootings, should not be disclosed due to it lacking the necessary probable cause. Over the next 2 years, that original draft and investigative file were lost. 6 months after the shootings, Anne-Marie Hochholder's mother killed herself. Several former students and teachers had PTSD. Greg Barnes, who was 17 years old, who had witnessed Dave Sanders' shooting, committed suicide in May 2000. Survivor Austin Eubanks, who was injured during the shooting, became heavily medicated, developing opioid addiction. Eventually overcoming and later speaking publicly about that addiction, Austin died from an accidental overdose in 2019 at the age of 37. There is not a clear motive of why the shooting was done, but everyone does have their own opinion. Going through them, the FBI's theory was how they both had mental health issues. Eric was a clinical psychopath and Dylan had depression. This theory was met with criticism because they both had depression, and Dylan was the first one to mention anything related to a killing spree in his journal. The media speculates bullying. School administrators and teachers at Columbine had long condoned bullying by jocks. Accounts from various parents and school staffers reported bullying in the school. Reportedly, they were regularly called gay slurs, and in one of the basement tapes, Dylan says, "You've been giving us shits for years." When talking to Eric's father about the jocks, he stated they sure gave Eric hell. Brooks Brown also noted Eric was born with a mild chest indent. This made him reluctant to take his shirt off in gym class, and other students would laugh at him. Nathan Van Durow, a friend of Dylan's and Alyssa Owen, who knew Eric, noted they were picked on. Nathan recalled that a cup of fecal matter was thrown at them. It has been alleged that both were confronted by a group of students from the high school, who sprayed them with ketchup while referring to them with gay slurs. Dylan had told his mother it was the worst day of his life. According to Brooks Brown, that happened while the teachers watched. They couldn't fight back. They wore the ketchup all day and went home covered in it. According to classmate Chad Laughlin, it involved seniors pelting Dylan with ketchup-covered tampons in the cafeteria. He said a lot of the tension in the school came from the class above. There were people fearful of walking by a table where you knew you didn't belong, stuff like that. Certain groups got preferential treatment across the board. Brooks Brown noted in his book that teachers commonly ignored bullying and that whenever Eric and Dylan were bullied by the jocks, they would make statements such as, "Don't worry man, it happens all the time." But many have argued against the bullying theory. Some even say that Eric was more often the perpetrator than the victim of bullying. Make sure to subscribe and let me know down in the comments below if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you for the next one.